Scotland, until 1707 a nation-state. Since then, part of a union governed by a parliament far to the south. But change is in the air. Scotland's relationship with its partners in the United Kingdom, especially the English, may soon undergo upheaval. If Labour wins the next election, Scotland will be governed by a parliament here in Edinburgh. The parliament will control nearly all aspects of Scottish domestic affairs. It will have the power to make new laws and to change the rate of income tax. Tony Blair says Labour's plans for a Scottish parliament will have no repercussions on the rest of the British political system. Others say that's being naive. They warn that Labour's plans are ill thought out and dangerous. Dangerous for Labour and the unity of the United Kingdom. Labour's blueprint for a Scottish parliament has been drawn up by the Scottish Constitutional Convention. Boycotted by Conservatives and Nationalists, the Convention's work has culminated in an agreement between the Scottish Labour Party, led by George Robertson, and the Liberal Democrats. In future, laws affecting Scotland will be made here in Edinburgh, not Westminster. Only foreign affairs, defence, social security and UK economic policy will remain with Westminster. Mike Watson, a Labour MP, meets one of his Glasgow constituents at his surgery. He's impatient for a Scottish Parliament. The key to its success, he believes, is the control of billions of pounds of public expenditure. This power, currently exercised by government ministers, will be used to tackle social deprivation and unemployment.
On education and training and housing, transport, all of those issues, decisions will be made in Scotland by democratically elected representatives of the people of Scotland. And that is a dramatic change and a dramatic increase in the democratic accountability of the system of government in Scotland.
South of the border, in Labour's northern English heartland such as Newcastle, plans for a Scottish Parliament are viewed with deep anxiety. When a Labour government last promised to create a Scottish Parliament, Labour MPs from the north of England fought ferociously against the idea. They feared a Scottish Parliament would use its powers to attract new investment at the expense of the north of England. Today, some Labour MPs from the north are warning that unless their region is given similar powers, they will attempt to sabotage any legislation to set up a Scottish Parliament. Like Mike Watson, John McWilliam is a Labour MP representing an area of high unemployment. It's a battle to survive for small companies like Anderson's, and John McWilliam fears they would face even stiffer competition if a parliament in Edinburgh was able to offer competitors incentives to invest north of the border. He believes unemployment, already higher than in Scotland, would rise even further.
It's going to create real problems in the north, in my constituency, in the border constituencies, real problems in all the northern constituencies.
Why is that?
Well, if you've got a Scottish Parliament with some fundraising powers that can increase or decrease levels of taxation, that can change the basis on, say, industrial development grants, small companies like Anderson's that visited this morning are just not going to be able to compete.
To meet these fears, Labour had intended giving English regions powerful elected assemblies. But the party leadership feared few English voters wanted them, so the policy has been watered down. Labour's northern MPs are angry, and some are threatening to retaliate by rebelling against the bill for a Scottish Parliament.
I think you've got to remember that any legislation that goes down is subject to amendment. And we could be very embarrassing in terms of the way that legislation passes. We could, for instance, take out some of the powers until such times as we're given certain guarantees. That wouldn't deny the Scottish people their own elected parliament. It would just deny them one that could do us damage until such times as we can level up the playing field again.
Under Labour's new policy, regions like the north will have to test support for an elected assembly in a referendum. But in Scotland, there'll be no referendum for a Scottish Parliament.
I think that if we have to have a referendum in the north, then the least we can do is expect one in Scotland too.
But the only way to get that referendum would be to amend the bill, or to attempt to amend the bill.
Yeah.
And you're convinced that would happen?
Well, there might be an attempt, yes.
And do you think there are many English MPs in the Labour Party who would support it?
I don't think I'm alone in my view. I don't think I'm being particularly outrageous in my views about this. I think there's a fairly broad level of support, certainly in the north, for what I've been saying.
In Scotland, Labour's U-turn on English devolution has also been greeted with dismay. It's not just a threatened rebellion by Northern Labour MPs that worries supporters of Home Rule here. They believe English devolution is the solution to the most difficult problem caused by the creation of a powerful Scottish Parliament. If ultimate responsibility for Scottish affairs is transferred from the Westminster Parliament to this Parliament in Edinburgh, that raises a fundamental question about the role of Scottish MPs at the House of Commons. Why should Scottish MPs at Westminster be allowed to vote on English issues when English MPs at the House of Commons will no longer be able to vote on Scottish issues? For nearly 20 years, Labour has struggled to answer this question. It's called the West Lothian question. In speeches by senior Labour figures, the official party line had been that devolution in England would provide the answer. If England, Scotland and Wales were all treated equally, if they all had devolution, then a Scottish Parliament would no longer appear to be an anomaly. The policy was strongly endorsed by Shadow Chancellor Gordon Brown in January.
The consideration of greater regional democracy was not firmly on the agenda when devolution to Scotland was being fiercely debated in the 1970s. And it is because a Scottish Parliament and an Assembly for Wales go hand in hand with the offer of greater regional democracy throughout Britain that what has been called the West Lothian question should not, in my view, be a barrier to proceeding with change.
From a Scottish perspective, weakening the commitment to English devolution resurrects this barrier. MPs like Mike Watson say unless English voters embrace devolution, Labour has no answer to the West Lothian question.
There will be a position when I concede there is an anomaly, say in the 5 years of a Labour government from 1997, while decentralisation in other parts of the country is being discussed and developed, and I accept at this stage there's not perhaps majority support from it amongst people living in England. But during that period, there will be an anomaly. I think it's something that can be tolerated on the basis that it's a temporary problem. It's a transitional issue, if you like. If English decentralisation did not move ahead at a sufficient pace, particularly, say, within the second term of a Labour government, then yes, I think problems could begin to arise.
If English devolution is the answer to the West Lothian question, power would transfer from Westminster to regions like the West Midlands. Britain would have a political system similar to federal Germany's. In the West Midlands, there's no enthusiasm for such revolutionary change, according to Labour MPs here. The Scots may yearn for it, the English don't.
If we had, or we're going to move towards a genuinely federal or quasi-federal system, the West Lothian question would disappear. The problem is we're not going to do that in the foreseeable future. What you will not do is to persuade people in England and the English regions that simply because of the imperative of Scotland, that there is almost a domino effect that has to happen in England in order to solve the problem of Scottish representation. The arguments about English regionalism have to be made in their own terms.
There isn't a great demand for regional government in England. In addition, the nature of the demand is quite different. The nature of the debate on regional government differs markedly from the debate on constitutional reform in Scotland. Scotland is perceived to be a nation, and it's a national right to self-determination that's invoked, whereas regional government in England is a debate about structures of government, about efficiency and such like. It's not the same kind of debate. And of course, at the end of the day, any Scottish Parliament would have greater powers than regional governments, which might arrive at some stage in the future, and therefore the West Lothian question would still arise.
At social events like this in Glasgow, Scottish Labour MPs have been trying to build a broad consensus for their Home Rule plans. Within the Scottish Labour Party, George Robertson has closed down debate on the West Lothian question. It won't work. The role of Scottish MPs at Westminster is bound to become a party political issue because most of them are Labour.
There is a possibility that at some stage in the future, a Labour government will be elected at Westminster, largely due to the fact that Scotland has returned a majority of Labour MPs, and that Conservative MPs in England will have a majority of the English electorate, and they will argue, quite clearly they will argue, that measures are being imposed on England by the Scottish MPs.
In Edinburgh, the former Royal High School stands empty. Scotland will be governed from here if Labour wins the next election. Labour needs an answer to the West Lothian question urgently. The most logical solution would be to stop Scottish Westminster MPs voting on English legislation.
This is the so-called in-and-out solution, which was considered by Gladstone in some detail when he was looking at the question of Irish Home Rule in the 1880s. Basically, what one could do is, either through law or through convention, one could say that the remaining Scottish MPs at Westminster did not vote on matters which applied only to England and Wales. And that would certainly be constitutionally a satisfactory answer to the West Lothian question. It would remove the anomaly.
Glasgow sends 11 Labour MPs to Westminster. If they were prevented from voting on English legislation, Tony Blair would be horrified. He might lose his majority on English issues. Some in his party are suggesting another answer. Allow Scottish MPs to vote on English legislation, but cut back on their numbers.
The question is only whether seriously devolved Parliament, whether existing levels of representation can be sustained anymore, and more important than that, whether it may not be necessary to have some adjustment to that, to carry through devolution itself. That, I think, probably is the biggest issue of all.
If Labour presents its case for the Scottish Parliament as one which will involve the Scottish Parliament having a great deal of autonomy and being able to do a great deal, then it makes it very difficult for Labour to justify having the same number of MPs in the House of Commons as it has at present.
Scottish constituencies have smaller electorates than English ones, which means Scotland is overrepresented at Westminster. Unlike Labour, the Liberal Democrats would cut the number of Scottish seats. At least it would show the Scots were making an attempt at addressing the West Lothian question. There is a logic to cutting the number of Scottish MPs. If control of Scottish affairs is transferred to Edinburgh, there'd be much less work for Scottish MPs to do at Westminster. But the consequences for Labour would again be unwelcome. Because most Scottish MPs are Labour, a reduction would make it more difficult for Tony Blair to hold on to power.
Of course, this is a very difficult issue. I mean, and the issue of reducing representation to an area, if that's what we're talking about, is extremely difficult. And extremely difficult for Labour because of our concentration of support in Scotland. My argument is, nevertheless, if we're going to be honest and serious about this process, we have to be honest and serious about the difficult questions too, not just about the easy ones.
I'm certain the Labour Party is going to win the next general election. What I'm equally sure about is, given our system of democracy, that it won't win every general election from now until the dim and distant future, which means a Conservative government who have nothing to gain by it would certainly look to cut the losses in Scotland.
They would cut the number of seats in
Yeah,
Scotland.
I think they would.
Some Scots would be happy to have no Westminster MPs. Like Robert the Bruce, they want independence. The ranks of the nationalists may again swell unless Labour delivers a powerful parliament. Yet the party can't ignore its impact on the rest of the United Kingdom.
One thing which is absolutely clear is that compromise does have to be found on this West Lothian question and on the other difficult issues of Scottish devolution, because the lesson that comes through very clearly from the debates about Irish Home Rule in the 1880s and through to the 1920s was that the failure to reach compromises on these difficult constitutional issues led ultimately to civil war and to the breakup of the United Kingdom. Now, few of us want to see that, and therefore I think the need for discussion and debate and consensus building is absolutely essential.
By the end of this century, the long battle for a Scottish Parliament may have ended in victory. Many Scots will be grateful to Labour. But Labour's refusal to address the consequences for the rest of the United Kingdom has exposed it to accusations that it is trying to gerrymander the British Constitution for its own narrow party political purposes.
The Labour Party announced today it was dumping the plan it adopted last weekend for a second referendum in Scotland to approve any tax changes by a new Scottish Parliament. It appears to have mollified some of the party's own internal critics. Dennis Canavan, for example, MP for Falkirk West, said he welcomed the end of what he called a ludicrous and unsustainable proposal. But for the Tories, the Deputy Prime Minister Michael Heseltine said Labour had now entered cock-up country. So what is the country to make of Labour's devolution policy now? John Nicholson reports.
Today's humiliation for George Robertson marks the party's third change of policy in as many months.
There is no support for the second referendum proposal, and I am saying today to the party and to the Constitutional Convention that a second referendum is not necessary and will not be pursued by the Labour Party.
For many in the party, today's events mark just the latest chapter in a sorry story. First, there was the promise.
No referendum. No, we'll legislate if we get a majority in Parliament for a Scottish Parliament which will be up and running as quickly as we possibly can get it, because that's what the people want and it will be good for democracy.
Mr Robertson's second position came when the supposedly independent Scottish Labour Party was told, it's widely believed by the London leadership, that there would have to be a referendum on devolution.
Not scared of saying sometimes you can get it wrong, and that sometimes you've got to change your mind, especially on the tactics, if you want to achieve what is right for Scotland.
Position 3 came last weekend. Mr Robertson announced his support for not just one referendum, but two.
The second test of assent has always been there. We've always said that the Scottish Parliament should have the power to vary tax up and down, but that there would have to be a separate test of consent before that power was used.
So you've always believed in two referendums?
We always believed that there should be a separate test of consent.
Position 3 was supported by Tony Blair and the press as mature, which may mean, who knows, that he regards Mr Robertson's fourth position as immature. Today, the Shadow Secretary dropped his plans for a second referendum. So, what are we to make of the mess? The seeds of the disarray really lie not in Labour's devolution plans, but in the party's taxation policy and its fears over how tax could be used in the election by the Tories. Labour cannot expose itself on the issue, the thinking goes, so the issue has to be neutralised, in Scotland through the use of a referendum. The downside, of course, is that in the process some voters, Labour devolution enthusiasts and Constitutional Convention partners have all been alienated. The Liberal Democrats are so angry that tonight some senior figures are predicting that they'll abandon years of cooperation with Labour over the Constitution and pledge themselves to oppose the referendum plans in Parliament. Back in Scotland, George Robertson must now hope that his devolution torture is complete. Having delivered for the leadership a safety net in tax, he's yet to prove that he's not in the process endangered his party's long-standing guarantee over Home Rule.